there, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of Russian foreign policy. It is Saturday, the 23rd of July, and I am recording this lecture on day X of what seems to be a never-ending and unrelenting heat wave. It is a chilly 98 degrees here in New Jersey, and for those of you living in the Celsius world, that's about 37 degrees. Which is felt or even matched in many parts of Europe, the UK, Germany, France, and for all my students, colleagues, and friends in Uzbekistan, 37, that's your temperature in the evening. The temperature can get all the way up to 45 or 46 degrees Celsius. That's like 115. So, man, it's just one unbelievably hot day after another. But you know what? What better excuse to then stay inside, have the air conditioners running. In fact, if you're listening to this with headphones on, you can probably hear the rather pleasant sounding white noise that's coming from the AC in my room. Make yourself a nice cold drink, however potent that you need it to be, and get pen and paper ready, because let's get started here. We have a lot of interesting things to talk about. And this is really a bridge week between finishing out our understandings of IR theory as well as the philosophies of Russian sovereign democracy. And then we're going to start applying them to areas around the world where Russia has been rather successful in bilateral relations among states of various regions. And the readings for this week are, I'd say, pretty straightforward, actually quite small in comparison to the previous two. I think that's going to be a welcome sign to many of my enrolled students here. But I have provided links to all of them down below. This is especially for those of you following me in the name of public scholarship, which, again, I would just like to take a quick moment to thank everyone for their comments and their inputs. I have acquired a couple of more Patreon supporters, so thank you all there. I'm almost at 10. If you want to just take this time right now to, kind of scroll down to my Patreon link there and just show me your appreciation for what I've done here. I love engaging with you all. And, it helps wean me away, as I've said, from institutionalized academia. One of these days I think I'm just going to give a standalone lecture about my own hot take on the current state of academia. I also just want to point out that there's a little website down below here that I discovered. It's called printfriendly.com. Now, this is the closest thing that you're going to get to an actual commercial in these videos. I'm not paid by them. They didn't ask me to do this, but Print Friendly is this fantastic little thing that you can use where if you want to read something that, of course, is behind a paywall, and this is like, Washington Post, New York Times, foreign policy type of stuff, you copy-paste the URL into the printfriendly.com screen. So you go to printfriendly, there's a little text space for you to dump the URL that you want in. You click the button, generate, and out pops a print screen or a print preview version of the entire article. So you can read articles without having to subscribe to many of these newspapers, which, technically speaking, they bombard you with ads and everything else. At the risk of sounding all political here, well, this is poli-sci, the WAPO does not need my subscription, especially if you just want to read one or two articles. So give Print Friendly a try. It's free. It's really, really great. Democracy does not die in darkness, WAPO. It dies behind a paywall. So a rundown of the lecture here to give us a sense of where we're going, and I framed them in 3 general questions, which my Rutgers students, this is a fantastic opportunity for you to throw in your comments in the discussion section on Canvas. And all of you listening in on YouTube, this is now par for the course. Let me know your thoughts and assessments in the comment sections below, and I will do my best to respond to them when I have an opportunity. Okay, first question. How has Russia benefited from the decline of American unipolar hegemony and capitalized on a new multipolar international arena? Right. So in other words, How has Russia been able to grow in influence as American foreign policy, as American credibility wanes in various areas around the world, right? And even if you haven't done the readings, I would be interested in seeing, and especially all of you in YouTube world, what your thoughts are on this open-ended question. Second question. How has the ideology of sovereign democracy worked against the perceived dysfunctionality of Western-backed colored revolutions? Now, this is something that you might want to stay tuned for, because one of the big things that I will focus on is how colored revolutions are seen as absolute anathema to sovereign democracy. Colored revolutions which have all of the hallmarks of a popular uprising against an unpopular and entrenched leadership ultimately ends up revealing that there's lots of strings that are being pulled and manipulated by outside forces. And then the third question rundown: what are your general thoughts on Russia's engagement with members of the rest around the world? Now, you can pause right now and offer your, hot takes on any of these in the comments. You can wait until the lecture is over, but I would really be curious to see what many of you think. Okay, so let's just recall also some of our previous hypotheses, right? I always like springboarding from our previous conclusions into new material today. And at this point, if you've been keeping up, this should be relatively obvious to many of you, right? First big hypothesis: the world is becoming increasingly multipolar and multilateral in the wake of American unipolar hegemony. Now, this doesn't mean that the United States is in terminal decline, right? Far from it. The United States is a prominent power within this new multipolar alignment. It is no longer a global hegemon, it is a global power. And so in this sense, we're more or less talking about not a post-American world, but really just an inevitable evolution of the international arena. The United States has certainly lost some credibility in the last 20 or so years. This is especially true with American-led regime change. But make no mistake about it, right? The United States remains a major political, economic, and military force in the world. It just has to now share that arena with the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Indians, among others. And, as far as realists are concerned, constructivists, institutionalists, even Marxists, this is an inevitable evolution. So it has nothing to do with everyone ganging up and hating on America, so much as just, the changing nature of the world is inevitably going to provide new powers. And the United States has now to face these and see whether or not they can be cooperative or threats. The second major hypothesis that we've already talked about is that the strengthening of Russian global influence is happening amid this decline of American diplomatic leverage. And it is interesting to point out that, again, 1999 was, in many cases, the apex of American unipolarism, and at the same time, like the lowest point of pre-Putin's, Russia. But it is after the engagement, the bombardment of Yugoslavia in 1999, and the territorial severance of Kosovo from Serbia/Yugoslavia, that American foreign policy goes from being benign to aggressive, right? Just simply the idea that America can do this without any repercussions. And this was, of course, followed in 2003. This is when criticism of U.S. foreign policy gains a little bit more salience. Nothing that would stop the American invasion of Iraq, and nothing that would really make the country think differently once we found out that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And then even attempts at regime change made Iraq, in many cases, worse than it was under Saddam Hussein. A tipping point, I think, was passed in 2015 when the United States was clearly on the side of the Syrian rebels in trying to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad, but Congress denied Obama the right to intervene in Syria, and it was right at that moment that Russia decided to engage. and not was, I think, instrumental in saving the Assad government from collapse, and by that matter, Syria from being an even bigger dysfunctional basket case than it is. I think that America's diplomatic decline reached a fait accompli in 2021, right? This was the announced pullout from Afghanistan, and the Taliban effectively took over the country in as many days, actually in less than as many days, as America had been in Afghanistan for years, right? America was there for almost 20 years almost, and it took less than 20 days for the Taliban to take over the entire, just literally wiping out everything that had been invested in that country in the previous 2 decades. And the final hypothesis is that globalization, as we've talked about, has empowered states of the developing world to evolve into independent decision makers. So this sort of feeds into one of the big things about unipolarism, which I have standalone lectures on, so I don't want to repeat myself here, but I will give a link to those within my existing playlist. Suffice to say, unipolarism sows the seeds of its own decline. And if American-led unipolarism included the mechanisms of transnational economic globalization, then it's not a surprise that some countries like China and India, and even Russia for that matter, are going to benefit. And so the rise of new powers is not a challenge to the American international system, right? It still remains within this framework of globalization. But there are new competitors within that framework. Competitors that are modernizing, but not democratizing, at least not by Western standards. So China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, India, right? They're all industrializing, they're modernizing, they love consumerism, they love the gadgets, they love all of the modern conveniences of life, right? But they're not democratizing at the same time. And this is something that was a genuine surprise to many American policymakers, right? There was this understanding that if you modernize, well, democracy is going to come along with that. Well, congratulations, those of us that, are able to see beyond Milton Friedman's theories of neoliberalism does not imply that economic freedoms give you political freedoms. You know what economic freedoms do? It gives you security to ensure your power within your own country. So the richer that you become, the more you can effectively buy stability and buy out the opposition. So it's things that we're going to be talking about in this lecture and else. So what then is the rest? Right? We've talked about the rest versus the West, okay? And just so we go through a cast of characters here, the West, and here I feel the need to once again put it in quotes because it's no longer a geographic expression, but kind of a way of life, right? The West meaning the existing American-led transatlantic network of liberal democracies, right? So we've got North America, the US and Canada, the UK, continental Europe, especially those that are members of the EU and or NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, right? This is the West, which of course is global in outlook, right? There's nothing Western geographically about Japan or South Korea, I guess depending upon where you are, on the planet. But the rest is kind of like everyone else, right? But to be more specific, the rest are emerging economic powers outside of the framework of American-supported liberal democracy. Right? That's the closest I can really come to a nice working definition. This includes the countries of BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It also includes Iran, Turkey, the countries of Central Asia, the Middle East, and this is especially true when we talk about Saudi Arabia and Egypt, for that matter. Africa, more specifically here, Nigeria, along with South Africa. We can also include perhaps Algeria, Morocco, maybe even Ethiopia. And of course, even Latin America. Brazil is certainly one, but there is also Mexico and Argentina and Chile, among others. What unifies these countries is that they are characterized by a notion of independent state decision-making that takes place either outside of the US-EU spheres of influence or in challenge to it. Now, most of them, of course, are outside of one of these two spheres of influence. And this is especially true when it comes to Central Asia and Africa. But when we do talk about Latin America, or even Turkey for that matter, right, the United States does have still a sizable degree of leverage. And yet, governments are looking for alternative avenues besides just that leads to Washington. So we are also noting that the rest includes countries that engage in some type of variation of sovereign democracy and stabilitocratic governance. So it's the type of state that is populated by a regime that places national security before civil liberties. It doesn't deny civil liberties, but it argues that civil liberties are useless when there are no national securities. So it's the exact opposite of the type of philosophy that we're taught in the United States, right? If you put national security over civil liberties, says Ben Franklin, you're going to lose both. A lot of these countries are saying, I don't know what the hell he was talking about, because if you don't have a robust military, strong state institutions, and other elements that protect your state from external forces, whatever civil liberties that you think you might have are going to be bought out. They're going to be privatized. They're going to be commodified. So strong states, strong institutions, strong leadership, a sense of patriotism for one's country is necessary in this day and age to not counter globalization, but shield you from some of its more deleterious effects. So how does then Russia benefit from all of this, right? What's Russia's angle? How do they effectively capitalize on this? Because, I'm sort of hinting that Russia is the one that's kind of putting out the soft power of sovereign democracy here. They haven't coined it. They're not, running around the world using this as the new, diplomatic ideology. But it's enough to provide an alternative space for sovereign development, modernization, and their own version of democratization, right? Russia's not against democracy. They're not against the improvement within countries that lead to various reforms and, increased privileges and political rights and civil liberties. However, they want to make certain that this is done through traditional channels of authority instead of externally supported liberal democratic principles. Okay? So this sort of opens up the field for other powers, other regions, other interests supporting the concepts of democracy, human rights, and international law, right? So in other words, Russia is they're not directly saying this, but they're implying that the US, the UK, the EU, this so-called West, no longer possesses a registered trademark on any of these ideologies. There is nothing inherently Western about democracy, maybe liberal democracy, but democracy is a universal concept, can exist in various shapes, sizes, and incantations around the world. And it is up to each state, society, and, I'm going to get to this shortly, civilization, to figure out how it works within their own countries. So this is, in a way, used as a counterbalance to American global hegemony. But even more so, it's built on the skepticism of American global leadership based on its past failures. Okay? So whereas the United States will still, recite the talking points that, we're a force for good in the world, we uphold principles of human freedoms and dignities, Russia, among others, and they do a really good job, especially when it's Lavrov saying this, points out that, the United States is kind of the good guys on a selective basis. They're not there the entire time, and they're not interested in bringing democracy and all this kind of good stuff to every country. In fact, the U.S. has strategic alliances with some of the most repressive authoritarian states in the world. So the United States is going to look at the plight of human rights violations in Syria while turning a blind eye to that of Saudi Arabia. They're going to talk about ethnic cleansing and minority harassment in Iraq, but they're going to turn a deaf ear to Yemen They're going to lament, the plight of minorities and apartheid in Russia, while completely ignoring the fact that the Palestinians are some of the most exploited people on the planet these days, living in a country that, according to the United States, gets a free pass on whatever it does. So if the United States does engage in democratic peace theory, it's selective. And it is done at the behest of American national interests, which, if the United States was to just come out plainly and say, yeah, we're going to do this when it suits our interests and we're not when it doesn't, we might take the U.S. more seriously. This also points out the notion of commercial pacifism, and this idea that, yes, two states with interdependent economies do not go to war with each other. They also increase harmonization, cooperation, misinformation is all but eliminated, and each country benefits from working with one another. And usually the brochure shows you France and Germany, or the US and Canada. And these are more one-to-one relationships. But when it comes to the United States pushing for economic cooperation with the developing world, it's definitely a more dominant subordinate relationship, right? It's not a one-to-one. It is not mutual. It is the U.S. exploiting a smaller developing country for resources at fire sale prices. And, in this regard, it is really more of a Marxist observation that the peripheral states, the developing world, right, they were already effectively victimized by colonization. There's just a new form of colonialization. They are still dependent on larger, more developed countries. And whether it is just, using the place for cheap labor, union busting, exploitation of environmental natural habitats, or just simply shackling the country to the U.S. through debt and loans and other elements like that, engaging in an economic relationship, a partnership with the United States will, argues sovereign democracy, cripple you. You will be at a permanent disadvantage. There is no way that you're going to be able to work your way out of that hole. And, alongside that are, of course, the countries that the United States has engaged in militarily in some way, shape, or form to either, liberate people in the name of self-determination or change the regime around in order to make it safe for democracy around the world. And whether it's, Serbia, Kosovo in 99, Afghanistan in 01, Iraq in 03, Libya in 10, 11, Somalia basically all around. No one ever pays attention to Somalia anymore. Syria in 2014, 2015, Ukraine post-2014, Georgia around 2008. The understanding here is that U.S. involvement in these countries has really not made anything better, but has at best exacerbated the problems, at worst provided new problems, made the country even less stable than it was beforehand. And this is something that we're going to talk about here. It counters the perceived effects of color revolutions that, according to Russia and other like-minded states of the rest, destabilize states and societies. So they don't help people out. They are enticing, but they actually make the country worse off because it erodes the sovereignty, it erodes the decision-making process, right, of these countries. So then what unites the rest? What are some of the things that these countries from around the world with different histories, languages, cultures, religions, what brings them all together, right? Just take BRICS, for instance, right? What's the common thread between Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil? Now, we can find these threads by noting what they are against, more so than what they stand for. So the first one is, as I've already alluded to, sovereign state decision-making versus transnational global trends and movements. A more clear-cut way of looking at this is some form of state economic planning versus the economic shock therapy that characterized globalization in the 1990s. So when we talk about state economic planning, right, we're not looking at, Leninist 5-year plans, but we are thinking about some type of leadership that the state has in allocating resources, deciding where to invest, but more to the point, engaging with transnational global forces, but not just simply opening the country up and privatizing everything and deregulating everything under the sun, just so Walmart or McDonald's or Coca-Cola could open up a factory in your backyard, right? The effects of that basically turn one's country into a colony, right? And this is something that Putin has mentioned repeatedly of late, and that is there's two types of states in the world today: sovereign states and colonies. And sovereign states are those that have the wherewithal, have the institutional fortitude to shape, redirect, and if necessary, rebuff transnational global forces. Economic shock therapy is just simply open your country up to the forces of capitalism and trust us, bro. We know what we're talking about, right? Doesn't work, right? Does not work. I mean, Russia will tell you everything you need to know about how it doesn't work by mentioning the 1990s. Another thing, stabilitocratic governance versus these colored revolutions. It's a new term that's been used within political science here, right? Stabilitocratic governance is this type of, top-heavy, executive-oriented leadership. It's a type of managed democracy, a managed political affairs, something that avoids, again, outside transnational forces. So we're looking at reform and progress on the country's own terms and at its own pace. So in the best of cases, right, stabilitocracies are countries where leaders might be reform-minded, right? They might be forward-thinking, but they realize we can't just simply open the country up and reform and become liberal democracies overnight, right? That's just going to create chaos. It's going to galvanize extremists, and it's just going to lead to an erosion of authority and legitimacy at the center. So reforms as they come, the same type of philosophy that we talked about with Russia last time. National security first, civil liberties second. If we reverse that, right, the civil liberties before security, we end up just getting entrenched, corrupt, dysfunctional governments that end up just being puppets of outside forces once again. So as you can see, there's a pattern here. What unites the rest? Strong state sovereign-making decisions to defend the state against external forces, right? The third thing, economic sovereignty and independence outside the neoliberal global framework. Another good example of this is the rest looks at Brexit and says that was a good thing. Sure, the fallout is going to be seen within a few years just because of Britain's disengagement from the European Union, but they argue, take a look at the draconian measures that were thrown at Greece just to keep it from going bankrupt, right? So the Greek austerity measures effectively killed the state. It undermined the sovereign decision-making of a country. It basically just parceled out the country's resources, industries, and even some of its islands. Almost put the entire country on eBay just to pay off its bills. So if you have Brexit on one end and the Greek bailout package on the other, which country has greater sovereign decision-making? They're going to point to the UK. And finally, the rest is united by noting the importance of cultural and historical legacies of civilizations. This is in reference to Sam Huntington's work, The Clash of Civilizations here. And many of the countries, Russia included, notes that there's absolutely nothing wrong with different cultures, religions, languages. This is truly what globalization is all about. But there is a noted difference in harmony in diversity versus the type of intersectional multiculturalism that is now permeating from Western liberal democracies, right? Especially the European Union. So, I like to think of it this way. You know how there are these picnic plates with the internal edges, with the internal borders? So, you got your mashed potatoes and gravy on one side and your little strawberry cobbler on the other. And, you like your mashed potatoes with gravy and you like your strawberry cobbler, but you don't like your potato gravy getting into your cobbler. So there's little borders, right, to keep little things here or there. That's kind of what this is. right? Russia has its culture, Iran has its, Turkey has its, China has its, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Is the reason why you can look at BRICS and say, well, what what unifies? You got an Orthodox country, a Muslim country, a Confucian country, a Hindu country, a Catholic country. I mean, where all of these things fit, and they fit by simply identifying their own important cultural features and investing in them. Whereas the Western-based liberal democratic framework likes to create this mishmash, right? This little fusion of everything all together, where national cultures are basically subordinated to something that, well, better, I'm just going to go ahead and use the word, woke, right? It's a sense of woke culture that, conservative, traditional nationalists are against. So this sense of civilizations here is a way of saying each country has a particular heritage, a specific historical path of development. And this should not be deviated from. In fact, this is something that needs to be celebrated and invested in order to maintain progress and modernity. Even more so is that if democracy is ever going to be reached in these countries, it is going to go so through its own cultural narratives and symbols, right? You don't have to give up your traditions and your identities and your values and sort of buy the Western democratic franchise, right? You don't need a Starbucks. You've got your own coffee. It's probably even better. You don't need McDonald's. You have your own national cuisine. We know that's better, right? And I'm giving you sort of extreme examples here, but this understanding that globalization just kind of turns every part of the world into a cookie cutter strip mall that you see, here in the United States. I mean, that's an attack on culture. It's an assault on tradition. So each country, its region, each civilization has something that it can and should be proud of, and this is what makes the country and the region so unique. So these are the things that unite the rest. It's interesting in a sense that they're more united in what they are fighting against than what they have, in common, which is not surprising considering the disparity, the cultural, the geographic, the linguistic, the religious diversity that makes up the rest. And I think another way of looking at what unifies them is how they are all seemingly unified against the dangers, the perceptions of these so-called colored revolutions. The term colored revolution, I forget who coined it. I don't know exactly when it entered into the lexicon, but it's now considered to be, accepted jargon, canon for that matter, right? Colored revolutions are those that happen in countries that have already made some transition to democracy, right? They've transitioned away from clear, single-party, old-school, classic authoritarian rule. But they emerged into this halfway house. They're not exactly democratic. They're not entirely authoritarian. They're kind of like hybrid regimes, right? And eventually, members of the public get dissatisfied with the status quo, right? This is inevitable. There's, political corruption, economic stagnation, what have you. And collective grievances inevitably evolve into organized protests. The thing is that colored revolutions don't give the public the outcome that they want, right? There's no additional transition to democracy. There's no greater sense of progress. The revolutions are usually more, visual, more rhetorical than anything else, right? So at the end, even if the hated leadership is ousted, removed, forced to resign, what have you, we end up really with the same type of leaders, just different people, right? Corruption remains, nepotism, clientelism remains. We oust the head of state, but we replace them with political officials that may very well have been part of a previous government that was ousted, or even in some cases were part of the actual ruling regime but got out before there was any kind of revolution. So we're not exactly talking about new leadership that's truly committed to democratic reform. There also are a number of patterns that we see where there's a failure to connect public protest with true civic activism. So in other words, people in the street chanting down with the regime, saying the current leader has to go. These are all genuine, grievances that people have, but there's no organization. And if there are, they exist in these small, little, disparate, relatively innocuous NGOs, right? And you'll always find a few pro-Western, pro-liberal, pro-democratic NGOs in every country. They tend to have more Facebook followers in the West than they do in their own countries. Sometimes they'll come to academic conferences and give their own takes on the current state of affairs in whatever country that they represent. And it usually, academics love these guys, but they're irrelevant back home. They have no connectivity to the people in the streets. They oftentimes will look down on their own fellow citizens as just being out of touch or brainwashed or not smart enough to see the larger picture. So, these NGOs tend to have more friends abroad than they have within the country. And the problem is that without organized leadership, anything to really move the country into greater democratic rights and freedoms just gets lost in the shuffle. And of course, the only people that really matter are different political rivals. And they have no connection to these NGOs whatsoever. They're ambitious, they're opportunistic, and they're more eager to basically get rid of the current people feeding at the trough because they're hungry, right? It's now their turn to steal, right? We're getting rid of the previous government, and now we're moving in, and whatever reforms that are promised, usually within the first, couple of weeks or so, usually just end up targeting members of the old regime. So we're talking about, eliminating corruption. We're not eliminating corruption as corruption. We're just eliminating the people from the old regime that were corrupt. And, it looks kind of nice on TV where, some people are kind of getting theirs, right? They're arrested, they're stripped of their titles, their homes, their property is confiscated. This is great. But it's only that group, right? In other words, the new government that comes in, right, makes these big promises, like no longer are people in power going to be stealing from the states, right? We're no longer raiding the office supply cabinets. Well, a couple of weeks later, we find out that raiding and stealing just happens again. Except this time, it's different people. And if there's graft, clientelism, nepotism, in the old regime, one group of people over here benefited from state leadership. Now, another group of people will benefit. So the grafting, the corruption, the dysfunctionality, the clientelism, it just continues. And sometimes, and this is where it gets even more interesting, if the new leadership happens to get support from the outside, especially the US, the UK, the EU, well, now they've almost got immunity, right? Now they can effectively be autocrats, but they're pro-Western autocrats, right? Instead of the previous, like this, Ukraine or Georgia are really good examples of this. The old regime, Moscow autocrats, Moscow puppets, now American puppets. How great is this, right? We're moving in the right direction. Now, this is great if you benefit from the new leadership, but the overwhelming majority of the people realize very quickly that nothing happens. In fact, things get even worse, especially when the new leadership is now backed by the West and the people in the street are told, hey, things are better. You're no longer a stooge of Russia or China or something else like that. So the failure to enact any improvements, any real improvements in socio-political life furthers public dissatisfaction and weakens social capital until the inevitable happens. General citizen in the country gives up. They withdraw, right? And it is this, excuse my French, fuck it moment, right? It's like, I don't care anymore. The opposition basically just engages in one palace coup after the other. We're just getting, we're just changing around oligarchs. We're changing around deck furniture on the Titanic. The ship is still sinking. The country is still mired in corruption. And more, the public just doesn't trust their elected officials anymore. And if you're young enough, the only thing that you do really care about is making enough money to buy a one-way ticket out of the country. Right? Out of sight, out of mind, I'm not engaging with it anymore. And this type of defeatism is normal, but it entrenches the status quo even more so. And, A disillusioned population is one that does not challenge the entrenched and corrupt leadership. Now, that in of itself is bad enough, right? It just kind of leads to this notion of rotten transitions. But the perception of colored revolutions from the mindset of sovereign democracy, right? And this is not just Russia, but we're going to stick with Russia as the primary example here, is that colored revolutions do more than just simply rotate corrupt leaders and disillusion the population. There's also the international factor, right? This idea that, and trust me, you can spend times really going down a lot of rabbit holes. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, but the more you search, the more you'll find. Follow the money, follow the paper trail, look at the NGOs. No matter how irrelevant they may be, there is this general pattern where protests against an unpopular government, let's just pick Ukraine as an example. It can be 2004, it can be 2014. This is eventually going to make international press. It's going to hit the US, the British, the German, the French press, and, we're going to get optimistic feelings of 1989 again, right? Oh, look at the people. They're in the street. They want more freedoms. They want more democracy. They hate autocracy. They hate dictatorships. They hate communism. They hate Russia. They hate Middle Eastern socialism. They hate, blah, 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 right? And without knowing the context behind this, we get giddy because we love this stuff, right? And we get New York Times op-ed pages all of a sudden casting the country as populated by people yearning for the type of democracy that exists in the West, especially America, right? And you can tell that this is more an engaged creative writing class than any real empirical evidence. But, whatever. There also is this idea that, the Open Society Foundation, the Soros factor, has something to do with, interfering in the internal affairs of the country. The public may have genuine grievances against the entrenched leadership, but that does not mean the U.S., the U.K., the EU, whatever international pro-democratic NGO exists, has the right, Russia and other countries say, to interfere in this process. Because what ends up happening is the protests very quickly become influenced, controlled, manipulated, financially directed from the outside, right? And it's lost on very few people that the protests are instigated from the outside with a clear Western lean to it. Okay? So opposition may be genuinely internal, but once it gains the attention of the West, that's when funding, money, support. Before he died, John McCain loves going to these places and taking selfies with a whole bunch of political opposition figures, oblivious to the fact that some of these opposition figures are just as corrupt, in fact, sometimes even more dysfunctional than the ones in power. But it don't matter, especially if it's Ukraine. The guy in power is a Putin guy. The guy in the street is a pro-American guy. At least that's what he said. He'll take my money. He took a picture with me. He's flying the American flag. He's got to be a good guy. The black and white dichotomization that McCain, John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, the New York Times op-ed pages has. I mean, it's almost childlike naivete. I almost wish I was that financially secure to look at the world in that stark this or the other. But the international factor does lead to the rise of opportunistic political elites that are more interested in becoming, and they have no problem becoming, a puppet of the outside. Why? Because that's guaranteed job security, right? If your goal is to just simply dislodge whoever's in power so you can have a turn stealing from the state, if that means, saying the right things to the local visiting American senator, or getting an interview with the New York Times, or if you're Volodymyr Zelensky, just zooming in on every award ceremony out there, you're going to do it. Right? You're absolutely going to do it. And if you get supported by American, British, or EU governments, all the more better. If you reach the levers of power, you are now entrenched. Right? It's absolutely fantastic. The thing is that once that happens, your country is infiltrated by external forces. So once again, what do we get? Well, the country needs immediate aid and assistance from the outside. So that means the U.S., the U.K., France, Germany, whatever it is, are going to come in, privatize a whole bunch of industries, inundate the country with consumer goods, push notions of multiculturalism. We want you to be like the West. And yeah, there will always be groups in that country that want that, but to the detriment of the country's sovereign decision making. Leadership becomes overwhelmingly dependent upon external forces. Before Zelensky, there was Petro Poroshenko. In a way, Poroshenko's whole shtick to the Ukrainian people were, hey guys, aren't you tired of being a puppet of Russia? Wouldn't you rather be a puppet of the West instead? We can get all sorts of neat things, hopefully including EU and even NATO membership. At the end of the day, the country is basically just stripped clean of its assets, of any type of independent, industrial, economic, political decision-making. And yeah, you may end up getting into the Western sphere of influence, but at what cost? Now, it's not that proponents of sovereign democracy fear colored revolutions because they genuinely care about the other country. It's that it's a way for the West to infiltrate itself into countries outside of their own sphere of influence. So when it comes to Ukraine or Georgia or Kyrgyzstan, among others, it's kind of a way in which internal contagion works with external opportunistic forces to basically colonize the country and give it and make it into a foothold for Western interests. Now, if you like the West, hey, this is fantastic. But at the end of the day, argues the rest, it's just another way for the United States to sort of seep its way into a country while taking everything that they can't, bolt down. So who is the biggest stealer in the country? The U.S. or the U.K. or other Western countries. So with all of this in mind, there's a couple of things that we can surmise. And in relation to Russia's soft power diplomacy. The first is that its model of sovereign democracy can be used as some type of counter to that of the American/Western liberalist international system. Okay, on one level, it shows that we can point out the limits, the shortcomings, the selective uses, and thus the hypocrisies of American liberalism. On another level, it gives countries the opportunity to promote stabilitocratic governance, right? And these serve as defense mechanisms against external encroachments and infiltrations of the country. The second is that by positioning itself as a counterweight to the American/Western liberalist international order, Russia now operates as a focal point for like-minded states and governments interested in their own forms of sovereign democracy. So this is the closest that Russia really has to kind of an all-inclusive ideology, right? Beyond the cultural and the historical ties that work for only a few countries, right? Russia's projection of sovereign democracy, as opposed to liberal democracy, is rather enticing to many countries around the world today, eager to not be victims of globalization. So, Russia is oftentimes regarded as anti-democratic, undemocratic. I think that a better way of looking at it is just simply illiberal, right? And we'll call it that, right? Sovereign democracy promotes a sense of illiberal democracy, or more to the point, collective democracy, right? The collective rights of the group over the individual rights of the citizen. And this is something that is difficult for, Western-minded thinkers to wrap their heads around, because we've always regarded liberal democracy as the pinnacle, the apex of political evolution. Sovereign democracy says national security first, civil liberties naturally come second. Strong walls, strong state institutions, and within that state, you can do whatever you want, right? A safe neighborhood is one that is either policed heavily or just crime has been eliminated altogether, right? And once that happens, you can brunch to your heart's content. The third thing is that by widening and deepening bilateral ties with key countries around the world, and Russia has done its homework in the last 20 years or so, right? Engaging with China, with Iran, and Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, right? Russia speaks to every country in the Middle East. The United States doesn't. There is not one country in the world that Russia says it will not work with. This puts Russia already at an advantage over that of the United States, right? The United States refuses to talk with some countries until they either change their regimes or see the error of their ways. Russia doesn't care about that, right? And this provides Russia, I think, with certain maneuverability to realign economic, infrastructural, and military investments in other parts of the world. Russia works with some country that historically has been its rival, right? Many people are surprised at how easy Russia and Turkey get along, or more specifically, Putin and Erdogan. Yeah, sure, many people think that the two are antagonistic. And yes, they have their differences, especially when it comes to Syria. But other than that, Russia is a fantastic focal point for someone like Erdogan, eager to increase his own autocratic leadership, to increase his own sense of top-heavy executive decision-making, right? Sort of the brand Putin is this idea that state leaders can stand up to transnational global forces, can tell the European Union no without facing repercussions, can tell the United States, thank you, no, we don't need that, without fearing economic isolation. And so I think in this sense, Russia and the rest, if there is once again that connecting thread, it's a genuine sense of looking for alternatives to the American-led neoliberal global order. It doesn't mean anti-American. It just simply means that the United States no longer has the only formula for success and development. It doesn't mean that Russia is going to turn this into a major selling point, right? It's not a counter-ideology. It's just simply a way of saying, look, building up robust state institutions protects your state from external encroachment and stifles internal contagion. And if you can do that, then whatever developments you have for your country 20, 30 years down the road, you are in control of. No one else is going to tell you to do that. So I'd like to finish out this discussion by looking at some applied cases where Russian foreign policy has been successful over the past couple of years, right? And to do so, I want to look at various incantations of the sovereign democratic model. So I will look at a couple of diplomatic inroads through the Middle East, the Balkans, and Central and East Asia. Now, I say right now I am excluding Africa, Latin America, and other places just simply for the sake of brevity. Now, if there's an interest with anyone for me to look at an area in more specifics, I can certainly offer a standalone lecture on top of the ones that I'm offering my Rutgers students. So let me know if this is something that you find interesting. I also would like to look at the indirect promotion of stabilitocracy as a form of top-down executive leadership. Now, we've talked about stabilitocratic leadership already as a bulwark against the perceived threats and instabilities coming from colored revolutions. We're finally going to look at what the basic definitions of that are. Strategic investments in multilateral economic and infrastructural agreements. This is particularly true with Russia's key partnership with China, as well as its own standalone pipeline network across Europe, as well as Central and Eastern Asia. And then finally, evidence of multipolarism blunting American leverage and influence. Again, Russia's rise, the inevitable turn to multipolarity, isn't inherently anti-American. It is, if anything, post-American hegemonic. Now, how the United States responds to this is really up to them. But so far, the media coverage has been critical, almost to the point of, I think, exaggerated paranoia. But this is not just specific to Russia, right? The same can be said for China. So we're going to be looking at that really towards the end, and that'll be our springboard into next week's discussion when we look specifically at the war in Ukraine. All right, so let's then begin with the relationship between sovereign democracy and the stabilicrat. Now, this is a term that sort of made its way into academic discourse from, I'd say, about 10 or so years ago. I attribute the term to Florian Bieber, who writes extensively about the degrees of democracy in various countries in the Balkans. So, stabilitocrat or stabilitocracy really implies a top-heavy executive leadership that exhibits disproportionate influence over socioeconomic and socio-political matters in the name of law, order, stability, and security. Now, there's nothing that links stabilitocracy with the direct ideas and philosophies of sovereign democracy, but the type of stabilitocratic leader is going to look to the principles of sovereign democracy with great favor, right? It's this idea that one is leading the country, governing the country is a better way of looking at it, in the name of some national interest, right? We are defending the national interest. We are defending the institutions of the state. We are defending faith, family, and fatherland, home and hearth, against external pressures and equally dangerous internal contagion. And the more there is this perceived threats of instability in one part of the country that could be co-opted and taken over by outside forces to interfere with the internal affairs of government, the more there is going to be this turn towards stabilitocratic leadership. Now, stabilitocracy doesn't necessarily have to be pro-Russian or anti-EU, right? The key thing here is that state institutions are invested in, right, as a way of resisting becoming someone else's puppet. So here we can see already the parallels with sovereign democracy and things that Putin has already said about in this day and age, one can either be a sovereign state or a colony of someone else. And if one does not safeguard one's institutions, if one doesn't invest in the security apparatus, if one does not put national security over civil liberties, right, you lose both, right? That's the whole thing. Now, this oftentimes results in the demobilization, sometimes even the direct outlawing of political opposition. Now, I want to be clear here. If I've already said that stabilitocratic leaderships can be both pro-Russian or pro-Western, whatever it is, once political opposition becomes targeted and they are demobilized, it doesn't mean that they're prohibited, but they are effectively reduced to one of two roles. Opposition can become loyal opposition, which means that they exist as an opposition party on paper only, but they basically will agree with and go along with whatever the entrenched status quo says. Or if they decide to really hold to their guns and, fight for the cause, believe in the ideals, they are reduced to a degree of innocuousness, right? They have little to no popularity outside of, let's say, urban centers. That's about it. Now, oftentimes, stabilitocratic leaders can be seen by liberal democracies as obtrusive and problematic, right, if they're not compliant with Western geopolitical policies. But as I've said, they can be supported by Western governments as well. There are a number of, speaking of the Balkans, right, a number of stabilitocratic governments that have been populated in, let's say, Montenegro, Albania, the para-state of Kosovo. This top-down managed political affairs tends to be given a green light if the top-heavy executive leader is pro-Western, pro-American, pro-EU. But if they happen to be critical of the West, they don't necessarily have to be pro-Russian, but if they're interested in safeguarding their own national interests first, and then EU, NATO, the US second, right, they're seen as potential thorns in the side of, liberal stability, right? So as long as the leadership is compliant, they can get away with a lot of things. And this is one of the reasons why entrenched corruption exists today in Montenegro, Albania, and of course, Kosovo. Now, if we take this understanding and we apply this to Russia's rather good relations with, let's say, state leaders in the Middle East, right, it becomes apparent to the unwary observer that Russia just courts autocrats. right? Russia just gets along with dictatorships no matter what. Now the thing is that Russia's relationship in the Middle East, right? It's a rather unique phenomenon because there's this assumption among Western journalists and pundits and policymaking circles that Russia's a newcomer to the region. In fact, Russia just sort of took a 10 to 15 year hiatus between the collapse of the Soviet Union and its return to the region amid the Syrian civil war. As the Soviet Union, Russia was very much present in Middle Eastern affairs. And today we kind of see that Russia's return to the Middle East is more or less a direct challenge to American-led security and stability, right? So you can see in this article here from Newsweek, right, where Russia's presence is easily for Americans marked by the presence of some bear, because, why not? Here's the thing, though. Russia's foreign policy in the Middle East is much more open, flexible, and adaptable than the United States is. In other words, Russia speaks with everyone, right? So Russia will partner up with Iran as much as Israel, right? Syria as much as Turkey, Egypt as much as Saudi Arabia. Whereas the United States picks and chooses friends and enemies and dichotomizes them between allies and rivals. Russia really doesn't have any rivals, or allies for that matter. Russia just sees everyone as potential partners, which gives Russia, I think, the tactical advantage. Because whereas the United States chooses to disengage with Iran, Russia has effectively turned Iran into a key strategic partner. And I think this is nowhere seen better than Russia's overwhelmingly successful engagement in Syria by all but ending the Syrian civil war, right? Their direct intervention in 2015, 2016 turned the tide of the conflict, effectively saved the Assad regime from, I wouldn't say that they were imminently about to be overthrown, but the country was about to descend into fragmented warlordism. Russia's involvement not only bolstered the Assad government, but did so under two legal principles. Number one, the Assad government was, according to Russia, and they have said this repeatedly, Putin had said this repeatedly in the interview with Charlie Rose, that this is the legitimate government of Syria. So Russia's not doing it because they like Bashar, but they're doing it because it's the legitimate government. And given the consequences that have happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, when legitimate governments collapse to, rebel uprisings, it's better to keep the government in power than it is to throw your fate to the wind and gamble on chaos. Because if we look at the other countries, regime change has led to instability, fragmentation, political and religious extremism, ethnic cleansing, and of course, terrorism. This is something that Russia did not want to have happen in Syria. Now, mind you, Russia does have a naval base in Tartus, so Russia does have some strategic interest. But it was also a really neat way of working with Iran and its proxy paramilitary government, Hezbollah, operating out of Lebanon, to basically gain a foothold in the region. Now, the thing is that since the collapse of the Hussein regime in Iraq, right, Iran has gained disproportionate power. Prior to that, Iraq and Iran kind of balanced each other out. By getting rid of Saddam Hussein and turning Iraq into a failed state, right, Iran now becomes the major power within the region. And the minute that Syria descends into civil war, well, then it just becomes a free-for-all for everybody outside the country to just kind of cast your bets. Now, as far as Iran is concerned, right, Iran has a vested interest in keeping the Assad family in power. Bashar al-Assad's family is Alawites, which is a religious minority within Islam. Now, just because of Iran's influence and power dynamics in the region, Iran speaks on behalf of basically the non-Sunni communities within the region, which in turn are supported by the Saudis, right? So ultimately, you think of the Middle East, and it's, Iran on one side, Saudi Arabia on the other. The United States is a key backer of Saudi Arabia simply because, among other things, Saudi Arabia sees Iran as its primary rival. Now, Iran's then non-Sunni coalition, right, includes Shia Muslims, Alawite, and Druze, but also, as it just turns out, most Middle Eastern Christians as well, right? Especially Armenians, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, among others. Syria itself is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic country. The Christian population is anywhere from 10 to 25%, maybe even larger, depending upon, who wants to fully acknowledge this. Now, Iran's backing of the Assad government by itself is risky because if Iran gets involved, that might draw Saudi Arabia or even Israel into the conflict. Russia sees this as an opportunity. Number one, Russia's partnership with Iran was already growing. Number two, Russia's got the military equipment and the diplomatic wherewithal to kind of enter into the fray as basically an objective arbiter, right? It goes in propping up the Assad government because that is, according to them, the legitimate government of Syria. What that effectively now does is give breathing room to Assad, but it also strengthens Iran's hold over the Shia, Christian, Alawite, and Druze coalition. In addition, it gives Iran leverage to use its proxy paramilitary government Hezbollah operating out of Lebanon to turn the tide of the war, right? By this point, the United States, the Turks, the Saudis were basically working towards supporting some Syrian rebel opposition, which was some hodgepodge, mishmash group of people that more often than not defected to some offshoot of al-Qaeda, if not were captured or their weapons were captured by the Islamic State. So it was clear to both Iran as well as Russia that the persistence, right, the permanence of the Assad government was paramount not only to Syria's territorial integrity, but a way of keeping the contagion of terrorism and state collapse from spreading elsewhere within the country. Now, as far as Russia's, relationship with Iran is concerned, Iran is public enemy number one as far as the United States, but this is great for Russia because if the United States backs the Saudis, Russia works with Iran, right? And this is the big question as to which of these two powers is eventually going to hold sway over the Middle East. It's kind of 50-50. On one side, you kind of have this U.S., Saudi, Israeli coalition. It's a weird relationship, but, common enemies make strange bedfellows. On the other side, you have the Russian, Iranian, and by proxy, Syrian coalition. And then you've got this guy here, Recep Erdogan, the Turkish president, kind of in the middle, looking always for one road or another. So, Putin just finished, I think, a rather successful visit to Tehran. And Erdogan, I don't know whether he was invited or he decided to invite himself, but, he comes to this conference between Putin and the Iranian government, and among other things, secures working agreements over the de-escalation of conflict in Syria. Now, Turkey has been an open supporter of Turkish-backed militia movements that neutralize the Syrian Kurds in the northern part of the country. So this kind of puts Turkey and Russia at odds, because Russia's interested in ending the conflict. Turkey kind of wants a buffer zone against the Syrians, against the Syrian Kurds, as a way of safeguarding their own southern borders. So they've come to this tacit agreement basically about just eliminating America's presence within the region. This has sent shockwaves through NATO because here it's one thing for Putin and Iran to get together because, these are pariah countries. But for Turkey, a NATO country, an allegedly pro-Western country, to be, in this photo with both Russia and Iran already says that even Turkey is willing to play both sides here. And, Russia's partnership with Turkey has been also rather unique, right? They have been historical rivals, but they can work on a number of, issues and agreements. This is especially true between Putin and Erdogan. Erdogan does see himself as a stabilicrat. He completely buys into the ideas of sovereign democracy, right? Make Turkey great again so it does not fall victim to external pressures and, threats and coercive, diplomacies. So Turkey and Russia have agreed to a joint security force in Syria, as well as furthering negotiating agreements for the, continued development of pipelines, industrial investments, and of course tourism. right? Russians are big tourists when it comes to Turkey, both those that just want to go to the beach and those that want to see whatever is left of Turkey's pre-Turkish Byzantine heritage. When it comes to Egypt, right? Today, as I'm recording this lecture, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is visiting Cairo and just simply, deepening relations between it and the Sisi government. The United States considers Egypt to be a strategic partner, and like I've said with all these other countries, they don't have to choose. They're not forced to choose between Washington or Moscow. Washington would like for them to go one way as opposed to the other. But when you're hedging your bets and you're looking for any kind of international support, a visit from Russia doesn't hurt, right? Especially if that gives the Sisi government leverage to distance itself from the United States if need be, right? So Russia will speak with everyone, including Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia, right? We tend to think that by Russia supporting Iran, that antagonizes Russian-Saudi relations. Saudi Arabia is a weird country as well, right? It is easily one of the most authoritarian states, not only in the region, but in the world. But it's one of those countries that the United States is never going to be pushing real efforts for human rights and other things about because, we like cheap gas. It's also a strategic ally in the region against Iran. But yet, Saudi Crown Prince has absolutely no problem finishing up a visit with Biden and then hosting Putin, right? So the media will kind of look at images like this and say, well, autocrats, flock together, right? I mean, you'll remember about a week ago, Biden went to Saudi Arabia and basically said to MBS, hey, give us cheap gas. And Saudi Arabia was like, nah, we're not going to do that. But we bros, fist pump for the photos, and let's just forget that Jamal Khashoggi even existed, right? So that's the Middle East, right? That's Russia's relationship with the Middle East, right? Flexible and rather adaptive. Now, what about the Balkans? Balkans are a little bit more of an interesting scenario here because they're in Europe. All of them have, all the states within the Balkan countries have committed to eventually becoming members of the European Union, but because of Russia's historical presence and ties with Balkan peoples, specifically Serbs, Montenegrins, Greeks, Bulgarians, among others, right? Russia is seen, as the cartoon implies, as the antithesis of European civilization, right? Russia's the obstacle to democratic development. They're the antagonist to countries of the so-called Balkans evolving into Southeastern Europe. I think that a lot of these assessments are a bit exaggerated and reflect, I think, wavering leverage coming from NATO and the European Union. This is especially true when we look at NATO members today. Aside from Serbia and Bosnia, all other states are now NATO members, right? Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece certainly joined. Montenegro, Albania, and Macedonia joined a couple of years ago. Serbia can apply for NATO membership, they just don't want to. And memories of the 1999 bombardment add much to that. Bosnia can join, but the country is so internally dysfunctional that there is absolutely no political unity on that. And then we have the disputed territory of Kosovo, right? Western media outlets love to portray Kosovo as a standalone independent country. It is a partially recognized parastate. It has no membership in the UN, and there are little to no prospects of it ever entering the EU or NATO because of other countries that refuse to recognize it. But, with that said, NATO has effectively closed the southern flank. To kind of look at the title here. Bosnia, Serbia, there's no likelihood of them ever joining. And, the reason for bringing in Montenegro, Albania, and Macedonia is not that they provide any real military hardware to NATO's security, but that it prevents Russia, right, from having a foothold. And this is kind of like NATO's deployment. NATO will constantly say that we're not anti-Russian, we're not a threat to Russia, this, that, the other thing. But yet NATO's membership, especially when it comes to the Balkans, has some strategic purpose of preventing Russia from enhancing its influence or extending said influence. And this is especially true when we look at Bulgaria and Romania in just a couple of slides here. But when it comes to Serbia, right, this is the unique relationship that everyone points out, right? Russia and Serbia, or I would say Serbia more so, views Russia as their big brother, right? One of their most trusted international allies and partners. This goes beyond just simply the Slavic, Orthodox relationship that they have, but historically speaking, right, Russia has served, when it's in Russia's interest, to defend Serbia against some type of aggression from Austria, from Germany, from the United States, what have you. I think that this, narrative oftentimes overlooks many cases where Russia abandoned Serbia, kind of left Serbia at the altar, because Russia at the end of the day is going to look out for itself. But there's one thing that keeps the Serbian appreciation for Russia going, and that is Russia has been the most steadfast supporter for Serbia's territorial claim over Kosovo. Right, this is sort of the big thing, right? Serbia has no problem granting unbelievable degrees of autonomy, power sharing, decentralization to the disputed province. But they will not recognize its independence, right? And certainly not outside of any UN Security Council resolution. The cultural links between Serbia and Kosovo are, incredibly, incredibly deep here. And Russia just sees this as a great way of preventing the United States from, gaining another victory within the region. And so, the graffiti that you see here on the wall, I believe that this is in Kosovska Mitrovica. It's one of the biggest cities within Kosovo that still has a sizable Serbian population. Right, is this sort of symbolic narrative that both Putin and Trump are like-minded people who realize that, Serbia was given a raw deal, and, Trump's whole America First policy disengaged the U.S. from the region, and it allowed Russia to increase its leverage, its presence. Now, look, as long as Serbia is not in the European Union, Serbia is free to pursue its own foreign policy. And this is where current Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić becomes this enigmatic figure, right? He's a perfect example of this stabilicrat that is neither pro-Russian nor pro-Western, but he's both and neither at the same time. And he's managed to somehow maneuver himself to become the ultimate power broker within Serbia, right? There is political opposition within the country, but they are electorally innocuous at this point. Vučić will never pass up an opportunity to pay a state visit to Russia, or if Putin comes, you might as well be the king. He is given a royal welcome whenever he is in Serbia. And why is that? Because Russia is Serbia's ace in the hole to avoid becoming a supplicant of the EU, right? Vučić has said that we want to become a member of the EU, but we will join as an applicant, not as a supplicant, And if membership rests on us having to recognize Kosovo as an independent country, then sorry, we will not join the EU. Now, this has led the EU to kind of be ambiguous about its position. Some countries have been adamant about saying you gotta recognize Kosovo in order to get in. Here's the thing. There's 5 countries in the EU that don't recognize Kosovo. The 2 big ones are Spain and Cyprus. And they have gone on record to say that there is nothing that will get them to change their positions. The other 3 countries, Greece, Romania, and Slovakia. Now, all of them have, to some degree, right, their own internal problems of separatism. This is especially true with Spain and Cyprus. Greece chooses to support Serbia because of long-standing cultural and historical ties. Romania because of Transylvania, Slovakia because of the Hungarian minority regions. At this point, there's been pressure on these 5 countries to change their opinions. It's not going to happen, right? Not only that, but Serbia has been relatively successful in getting some countries to withdraw recognitions of Kosovo. So at one point, Kosovo was recognized by about 110 to 114 states, I forget. But they have lost somewhere around 14, 15 or so, down to about 97, 98. It's not enough to turn the tide, but it's enough to keep Kosovo a disputed, frozen conflict, right? It's recognized by the US, the UK, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Germany, France, right? That keeps Kosovo on the map. But it is not recognized by Serbia, Russia, China, Spain, Argentina, India, Indonesia. So it puts Kosovo on the map, but in a slightly different color shade from that of the rest of Europe. Right. Russia also enjoys comparative leverage in the Bosnian Serb Republic. Now, this is an internal province within the state of Bosnia. It's about 49% of the territory that is controlled by Bosnia's Serbian community. Its longtime leader, Milorad Dodik, another great example of a stabilicrat, right? One that has effectively become a power broker over Bosnia's future. They have repeatedly threatened secession, either becoming an independent state or merging with Serbia. Republika Srpska's relationship with Russia is that it must abide by the principles of the Dayton Accords that ended the conflict in Bosnia in 1995. Now, many Western leaders, policymakers, academics lament Dayton because it basically is the primary example of a peace agreement that ends a war, that stops the killing, but does so by effectively undermining the sovereign functionality of any country. So the existence of Republika Srpska to many proponents of Bosnia's eventual unity is that it has a disproportionate degree of power. It doesn't play by the rules of the game. Some are even calling for its abolition, if not its reduction in power. This usually is all that Dodik needs to respond by saying, if that happens, we're going to go with a referendum for independence, because if Kosovo can secede, then so can we. And all that needs to happen is Russia recognize us, and are you going to go to war with Russia over this? Russia's insistence on maintaining the Dayton Accords is that this is the only document that all parties still agree to. If at some point, right, there is some agreement to either integrate Republika Srpska more into Bosnia, or for Bosnia to just recognize that it's a decentralized confederation, Russia will support whatever the Bosnian Serbs want. But in the meantime, right, Dodik can rely on Putin and Russia, right, for economic support, diplomatic leverage, as well as the cultural ties that bind the two together, right? Very similar to that of Serbia. And look, let's talk very briefly about this orthodox connection here, right? Russia's soft power goes beyond just sovereign democracy, but it plays into the Neo-Byzantine model. Serbian Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy find commonality not just in religious ties, but also in cultural conservative elements as well, right? Both churches see themselves as bulwarks against, intersectional identity politics or multiculturalism or globalization and all of the, vices that come along with consumerism, secularism, among others. It's not enough to, sway political decisions, but, this was a major protest that took place in Montenegro a couple of years ago, when the Montenegrin government under Milo Đukanović, again, good stabilicrat, but a pro-Western one, was threatening to create his own Montenegrin Orthodox Church by appropriating property, churches, and monasteries that belong to the Serbian Church. Now, within Montenegro, right, the conservative, anti-Western political elements are very much pro-Serbian, anti-EU, anti-NATO, pro-Russia. So culture and politics can oftentimes become intertwined and mobilize people to challenge decisions of government. Russia's influence within this is nominal, but Western media is usually prone to just simply say that anything against the pro-EU decisions of Montenegro are usually brought on by Serbian nationalists and, of course, their, Russian puppet masters. Now, look, Russia's presence in the Balkans is, I think, measured more in cultural presence than anything else, right? Russia invests within the region, but nowhere near as close to that of the European Union. So when we talk about the Balkans, Serbia included, right, the biggest investors are Germany, Austria, the UK, France, Italy, among others. The perception among people in Serbia is that Russia is there to protect them from just being completely taken over and exploited by the European Union. In this case, it's more, as I said, of a cultural symbol than an economic presence. But Russia is there, and Russia can be seen as an alternative source of investment if the EU's or the American investment comes with strings attached. Now, this is just Russia. We haven't talked about China. Vucic has done a rather neat job of sitting on really three chairs right? The EU one, the Russian one, and the Chinese one. I would say that the Russian-Chinese one is more of a couch, right? They're not antagonistic really towards each other. But, Russia's investments are, I think, much more visible than that coming in from the European Union. I think nothing is better than the proposed and ultimately canceled South Stream pipeline. Now, we're going to be talking about Russia's pipeline politics next week and the week after when we look at Ukraine. But I just want to touch on, if people don't know about this, you may have heard of Nord Stream, right? You may have heard that there is a major pipeline connecting Russia to Germany, and then there's a second one that's being built right now, right? Which basically shows Germany's energy dependence on Russia. There was a proposed South Stream pipeline that would have done the same thing, but it would have secured Russia's economic and political leverage through the Balkans. The original idea was to go through the Black Sea and hit land in Bulgaria, in which there would be two major pipe routes. The northern one here would go from Bulgaria to Serbia, and of course have little subsidiary pipelines into the Bosnian Serb Republic, Croatia, ultimately going through Slovenia, and finally Italy here, right? This is the end goal of all the pipelines. This stuff just keeps the smaller countries in line. The end result is keeping the bigger countries as loyal customers. A second pipeline would have gone south here at Pleven and gone through Greece, under the water, and still into Italy. So this brings in Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Hungary, Austria, among others. This is one of the reasons why Bulgaria, I think, was given hasty EU and NATO membership as early as it was, right? The big thing here is that Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU in 2007, and many say that it was prematurely done. But it was done to take them out of Russia's potential sphere of economic influence. Because now that Bulgaria is a member of both the EU and NATO, Bulgaria was told to effectively cancel the pipeline, right? So they rejected the pipeline taking place in Bulgaria, which, for about 24 to 48 hours meant that Russia's South Stream dream was shattered, and everybody's, taking a victory lap within the Western press. As it turns out, within the very same week, and I might be, just moving this along here, but, I don't have the play-by-play, but Putin was in Ankara visiting Erdogan, and at a press conference, one of the reporters, one of the journalists had asked him in so many words, what do you have to say about the pipeline, the South Stream pipeline being canceled, and Bulgaria, thwarting your efforts about this? And Putin, I think, kind of turns to Erdogan right there. He got two of them at the podium and kind of says to Erdogan, well, I wasn't planning it on initially going through Turkey, but what do you say? Want to build another one through Turkey instead? And Erdogan's like, yeah, sure. Why not? And so this revised Turk Stream project, right, it goes through Turkey, which does the fantastic job of securing Turkey's energy reliance on Russia, right? So, surprise, surprise, Turkey and Russia get along quite well. At the end of the day, Ankara is not going to, distance itself, alienate itself from Russia. The pipeline, however way that it goes right up to the Greek border and then stops. Right? It just stops. The pipeline has an extender, right, to kind of like tempt the Greek government, which at this time was still reeling from, EU bailout packages and austerity measures, right? So it's desperate for money to all but say, can we have some of that? Because when South Stream was canceled, a lot of the countries here were looking forward to it. Now suddenly these ideas are up in flames. So instead of Bulgaria, it's going through a non-EU country like Turkey. And then it's just going to make it all but impossible for Greece to ignore, especially when countries like Serbia, Hungary, Austria, even Northern Macedonia beforehand were saying, hey, we want this, right? Bulgaria can be pushed into a corner. Hey, that's Bulgaria's problem. So the envisioned Turk Stream pipeline will go through Turkey, through Greece, and then say, well, Bulgaria, you said no, we're not going to, interfere with that, and just go roll the way up here through Serbia and, of course, into Italy and Austria. So, what we see is, Russian foreign policy definitely maneuvering through the gaps and the loopholes of, Western liberal alliances. As well as capitalizing on the idea that Europe is energy dependent on Russia. And this is going to be seen pretty clearly this coming winter if media reports and prognoses are true. The sanctions against Russia and Russia cutting off gas supplies to Europe, we're going to see which countries are economically dependent more so on the other. And then finally, I want to get to Central Asia, right? This is probably a region of the world that very few people know about. But let me tell you, the more I learn about it, the more I see how fascinating the region happens to be. And there's very little scholarly work done on it because I think that it's the one region that is clearly outside of the American, the EU, the NATO-led, spheres of influence. This is Russia's backyard, and this is China's business park. Here we have the current leadership of the five stands. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and then finally Uzbekistan. Russia's influence never really left the region. I think the most clear example of this is the ubiquitousness of the Russian language, which is, if not one of the official languages of state, it's the unofficial language of commerce, of business. It's also the language that inter-ethnic groups will speak to one another. If Uzbeks can't speak Kazakh, if Kazakhs can't speak Dari, they're all going to default to Russian. Russian is still one of the main languages spoken in many of the urban centers, right? You don't have to be ethnically Russian to speak it. So in that sense, Russian is the lingua franca of the area. It's the language that ties everyone together. Cyrillic is still widely used. Everyone that is in a position of power needs to speak Russian. So in this sense, Russia's influence continues even in the post-Soviet area. But beyond that, Russians themselves continue to live in the area, right? So we think it's more than just simply Ukraine and Belarus, but Russia still has cultural centers, art centers, educational centers. Look, and let's be honest, even the Soviet legacy runs clear through all of these countries. Right? Every single Central Asian state has shared memories of the Soviet Union, the sacrifices made during the Second World War, the monuments to Soviet leaders. Some of them look, partly abandoned and disheveled, but they're not removed. Memories of the Second World War, of participation in the Red Army, of the collective struggle against fascism. I mean, all of these are commemorated, and these are not old monuments. Some of them are newer ones, right? Memorials to those lost during the Second World War. Victory Day parades happen in more than just Russia. It's a national holiday in all of these countries. Right? So these are things that are part of these post-Soviet countries because the Soviet Union is seen as part of their history, right? Their identity, their sacrifice. And even beyond the war, right, the Soviet legacies from the 70s and the 80s, right, the golden age of mass transit, of urban development. I mean, all of these things make Central Asia today unique. I mean, the metro system, to just give you a little example here, in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, I mean, these are subway stations. I mean, this puts the subway system in New York to shame. I mean, this is just absolutely beautiful in comparison with the fallout-looking zombie apocalypse views of New York City here. Some monuments to Lenin have been removed. This one in particular, there was a big statue of Lenin here in Tashkent that was removed in the early 90s. The Soviet-era Hotel Uzbekistan is still here, and instead we have, Amir Temur doing his best, Marcus Aurelius pose. But look, the leadership of Central Asia, I think, fits very nicely into the stabilicratic type of leadership that sovereign democracy invites. Before there was Putin, there was Nursultan Nazarbayev, who's still alive today. He stepped down as Kazakhstan's longstanding president and still, wields significant influence throughout the country. But Nazarbayev was actually the type of sovereign democratic leader throughout the 90s that in many ways Putin may have looked to for support and guidance. The new president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, been in power for about 2 years or so, is very much the successor to the Nazarbayev stabilicratic regime. It is still a top-down, executive-managed state, but it's one in which there are reforms that are being made gradually, but at the behest and at the discretion, right, of people in power. Uzbekistan probably shows the best example of progressive leadership. Its longtime leader, Islam Karimov, made Uzbekistan one of the most closed-off countries in the world. But even today, right, people that I've met, even my students will say, Karimov was necessary for the time. But when he died in 2016, he was succeeded by the immensely popular Shavkat Mirziyoyev, who, in my opinion, is kind of leading the charge in modernizing, developing, globalizing the state, but still under this type of managed executive leadership, right? So he courts Russia. He invites Chinese business partnerships. He looks to Emirati construction companies. And yes, he will invest in American universities and modernizing Tashkent to make some parts of the city look like New York, London, Boston, for that matter, right? So both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, in my opinion, are really leading the charge in this type of stabilitocratic sovereign democracy, where in both cases, right, we have seen sustained political, economic, and cultural links with Russia while maintaining their own path for development and modernization. This may actually lead to both countries, I'm sort of, surmising, to almost bypass democracy altogether and just kind of go for the type of Chinese-oriented corporatism, meaning that, economic development and, reform-minded leadership is all that's needed, right? We don't need the type of electoral turnover that we find in parliamentary democracy. I'm not going to get too ahead of myself here, but suffice to say, both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, their spheres of influence are within the Russian, Chinese, Iranian, Indian areas. So the push for electoral democracy is not really at the top of the list. And as long as the government maintains reform and progress, the ordinary person in the street is going to be happy with their increased consumerism and their qualities of life. Tajikistan remains still in development, right? Its longtime leader, Emomali Rahmon, is still in power. He's the last of the original Central Asian leaders. And it's unknown where the country will go once he either dies or, more likely, retires. He could yield power to his son. He could open it up to other party officials. I know that within Tajikistan, many are looking to what is taking place in Uzbekistan, Tashkent in particular, and saying, we want that too. Right, we're ready for modernization, we're ready for development, stability is certainly fine, but we would like the quality of life, right, that we see just next door. Then there's Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan's the weird one because Kyrgyzstan is the one country that changes leaders every 5 or 6 years. Kyrgyzstan began under the longtime leadership of Askar Akayev from 91 until 2005, the first tulip revolution, which unseated him after he had sort of hinted that he would give power to one of his family officials. And of course, by that point, corruption had certainly entrenched him within the political apparatus. The Colored Revolution gave way to a 5-year leadership of Kurmanbek Bakiev, who, interestingly enough, was unseated in the second Colored Revolution, the second Tulip Revolution. Arguably the most successful leader of Kyrgyzstan was the interim presidential leadership of Rosa Otunbayeva, who governed for little more than a year, but she was the one that really believed in the cause of democracy. Right, democracy, democratic development. She has certainly foreign credentials. She served as Kyrgyzstan's first ambassador to the UN and was able to maintain, right, a rather good working relationship with the United States, Russia, and China, which was not really looking at Central Asia at the time yet. But in my opinion, she has enormous street credibility among ordinary Kyrgyz. She was barred from running for president in 2011 under some, spurious idea that she was outside the country for a certain period of time, and that disqualifies her from running. This is largely to prevent her from moving the country into another direction. Instead, the country came under the leadership of Almazbek Atambayev until 2017. He was succeeded by Soronbay Jeenbekov in 2021, and Kyrgyzstan is currently under the leadership of Sadir Japarov. So Kyrgyzstan is the oddball out in that it has more than one leader, and it really was under Jayembekov and now under Japarov that this type of stabilitocratic leader is solidifying. Right, we've gone away from the type of transitory politics under Otunbayeva, and we are now looking at more centralized authoritarian leadership. Kyrgyzstan maintains significantly good relations with Russia, as well as seeking to solidify partnerships with its other Central Asian neighbors. And then there's Turkmenistan. This is sort of like the North Korea of Central Asia. Turkmenistan was for about 16 years under the leadership of one of the most interesting dictators of modern history, Saparmat Niyazov, also known as Turkmenbashi. Just go Google, search on YouTube for Turkmenistan under Turkmenbashi, and it's just, you're not going to be disappointed. When he died in 2006, his leadership was succeeded by Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. Just try to say that, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. He was featured on one John Oliver skit because of his love of horses. He stepped down from politics earlier this year, stepped down, retired, but gave it to his son, Serdar Berdimuhamedov. It was rumored that Gurbanguly would retire, but all of a sudden he announces that he's stepping down. Elections are going to be held in the next 48 hours. Everybody goes to the poll and vote, and surprise, surprise, his son takes over. I don't think that these elections were free or fair, but Turkmenistan is not one of those countries that people pay attention to, and it has very little international engagement beyond that of Russia and China. But interestingly enough, after coming to power, Berdimuhamedov's first state visit was to Russia. So in this sense, right, Central Asia is very much within Russia's sphere of influence, not just through historical memories and shared histories of the Soviet past, but also within Russia's extensive pipeline network, right? We're going to, if Russia has invested in pipelines that are going from Russia through Central Europe into Germany, Austria, and Italy, you can be sure that they have the same thing in Central Asia, going through the region, ending in China, India, and Iran. So these pipelines do really a number of things, right? A, they keep the countries within Russia's sphere of influence. Two, it keeps them economically, I wouldn't say dependent, but certainly connected, right, to the Russian grid. And for many of these countries, this is not that much of a problem, right? For them, this is just a continuation of the Soviet period, where many of these areas were connected through infrastructural grid lines, electricity, railways, telephone lines, hydropower electric dams, things like that, right? So just re-engaging with Russia just simply means continuing, right, what we've been doing. Now, when we expand this to the larger region and we include China, for instance, Central Asia now becomes a major focal point for investment in the next 10 to 30 years. Beyond the existing pipelines is China's ginormous One Belt, One Road economic initiative, right? And this is effectively China's major infrastructural project that not only seeks to integrate, right, neighboring countries within its own emerging economic power, but because China's major areas are to connect it with Russia, the Black Sea area, Europe, the Middle East, almost all of these roads, pipelines, networks, railways are going to go through Central Asia. This means that there is enormous amounts of money to be made, major construction projects that are taking place, and it's effectively putting one of the least known areas of the world on the map. When I was mentioning to my bank a couple of months ago that I was going overseas and I was going to be staying in Uzbekistan, just so when I, stuck my ATM card in, it wouldn't come back saying canceled, oh, your card is stolen. I kid you not, everyone was like, is that a country? Where is that on the map? Can you spell it for me, right? When you're done looking at YouTube videos of Turkmenbashi, just take a look at the major historical areas of Uzbekistan, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva. Take a look at the food that's there, right? The country is coming out. It's emerging onto the digital map. Tourism is something that is going to be a major thing in the near future. But when we also include transit routes We're talking about connecting these remote areas with larger parts of the world. Russia is at the forefront. Now, where does Russia fit in with all of this, right? There's certainly understanding that China is in the driver's seat. So Russia's big thing here is to serve as almost like a backup partner in case China becomes too influential and sort of runs ramshod over these Central Asian states. But more to the point is that a lot of these countries are already part of international organizations like the Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So this does a couple of things. One, it's kind of like Central Asia's version of the European Union, just minus the heavy degrees of federalism. States are able to maintain their own sovereign decision-making, projects and ideas, but it integrates areas that for centuries beforehand were integrated into larger empires and states, right? So rather than telling everybody, okay, your borders are now where you are and you're all on your own, we're basically continuing with patterns of interconnectivity, right? Central Asia is the Silk Road. In this sense, it is the conduit of communication, of trade, of ideas, of food, of values, among other things. So to say that, Russia is a peripheral player outside of the West is, I think, just, something that shows one hasn't really done their homework. One really hasn't done a lot of research. And, again, before this lecture, I Googled Russia and the Middle East, Russia and the Balkans, Russia and Central Asia, just to see what articles come up, right? And whether this is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, BBC, the Wilson Center, right? Russia's problematic, right? It's either looking for friends in the Middle East and it can only hang out with the loser countries like Iran. It's playing with fire in the Balkans. It's using Serbia as its proxy to effectively challenge the security of NATO or the EU. Even when it comes to Central Asia, I just looked up this one, right? Russia's sanctions are seen as loosening Moscow's grip on Central Asia. Central Asian leaders are meeting amid Russia's declining role in the region. And of course, with friends like these, how Russia's invasion of Ukraine hurts Central Asia. And I'm wondering where they came up with their data. Because what I've explained to you now shows that Russia is very much an active participant in all three of these regions, which, just by reading the titles kind of gives me a sense of this one very popular meme on the internet, and kind of like this. This is the, incomprehensible Western neoliberal media screams here. So, to conclude, and there's been a lot here that we've covered, and I hope that you found a lot of this stuff interesting. And if you'd like me to get into more specifics, I can do, standalone lectures as well. But Russia and the so-called rest, right? What does this mean in the grand scheme of things? Well, Russia's so-called turn to the east, right? Its decision to finally say, all right, we tried working with the West doesn't want to work with us. We're sanctioning it. It's threatening our own security, whatever it is that you want. But Russia's turn to the East has significantly limited the effects of Western-backed sanctions since 2014, right? So the United States can issue one severe sanction package after another. All that this does is just reinforce Russia looking towards China or India, or re-engaging with its partners in Central Asia, right? So aside from America's closest friends and allies, right, aside from those states already within the transatlantic neoliberal alignment, the rest of the world is not really all that interested in joining in the effort to isolate or cripple Russia, right? There's money to be made. There's business to be done. There's opportunities to take advantage of, right? Why sanction Russia if it's going to economically hurt you as well? Why isolate Russia when it has had a visible institutional, cultural, and historical presence in your area for decades, right, if not centuries? So the reluctance of the rest to jeopardize relations with Russia has largely complicated American efforts to manage ties even with its own allies. So as Europe is beginning to reel from the economic fallout from sanctions, the rest of the world is saying more money to be had, more construction projects, more business deals, more pipelines, more whatever. And, if nothing else, regardless of whether you agree with what Russia is doing or not. The fact is clear that Russia has proven to be far more flexible and versatile in its foreign policy by disengaging from any liberalist ideological principles. So, the Middle East is a great example of this. Russia will talk to everyone and anyone. The same thing happens in Central Asia and Africa and Latin America and the Balkans and wherever, even within the European Union, right? Russia will, maintain relatively good ties with Hungary, even with France and Germany at the end, right? The two big spoilers in Europe's unified stance against Russian sanctions will most likely come from either Berlin or Paris, because they see the sanctions as detrimental to their own economic power base. So this gives a space and a voice to those governments opposed to Western interventionism in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria. And look, in many parts of the world, the United States, the EU, NATO has no influence. America's presence in Central Asia, for example, is really more of a luxury item, and that's really only in the more exclusive areas of the urban capital. Other than that, there's no push for democracy and human rights beyond a few rhetorical statements. So in that sense, a lot of countries, they don't need to look to the United States because they're not on America's radar. And if Russia or China or Iran or India or the Emirates are going to be the ones investing and developing the countries, well, then so be it. I mean, this is effectively how the West operates within a multipolar framework. And this forces, I think, the United States to fall back on realist-based policies of national interest, which was loosely masked for about 10-15 years within the liberalist framework of human rights and freedoms. So there's a lot that we covered in this lecture, and because of the sake of time here and the sense that this is only a 6-week course, we've only really skirted many of the topics, right? Topics that I think that we can go into further detail if I provide standalone lectures. I'm interested to see what you all think, both my registered students as well as those following me in the name of public scholarship. So thank you all for listening. Next week, we are doing the topic that everyone is waiting for, the war in Ukraine. So stay tuned, everyone. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you in a couple of days.